Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the last time my next guest was here, he was at the height of his powers as Chancellor of the Exchequer ahead of the budget in March. The arch-tactician, except, of course, that he came a terrible cropper as the British people ignored his blood-chilling warnings of economic apocalypse and they voted to leave the EU. Theresa May then sacked him and there has been, as you would expect, a period of reflection. But now he is back. Is this a slightly different George Osborne than the George Osborne I used to talk to?
Well, I'm learning a lot. I don't want to trade on my experience of being Chancellor. I don't want to be 60 or 70 years old talking about what I did when I was 38, 39, 40 years old. And I'm therefore in the future business. I'm trying to learn as much as possible about the world, get out of the inevitable tunnel you find yourself in when you're doing one of those top jobs in British politics, and try and understand not just what I got right, but also what I got wrong.
Well, turning to what you got wrong, as you so helpfully helped me to do, the referendum above all. Do you have any reflections now on, you had all these blood-curdling warnings, the punishment budget, the economic bomb under the economy and so forth, 800,000 jobs going in 2 years, and people did not believe you and they did not listen to you. Why do you think that was?
Well, look, of course, people in the end chose by a majority, a small majority, to leave the EU, and I have to respect that, and I also have to therefore accept that the campaign we fought was the wrong campaign. It didn't work, it didn't persuade people, which is also the purpose of the campaign. And I think if anything, maybe, you know, we lacked some of the authenticity, some of the optimism of the Leave campaign. I think we discovered there was not much out there in terms of support for European friendship, and so we ended up talking a lot about the economy, and as Chancellor, of course, I was centre stage in that because of the economic risks that we saw and others saw in leaving the EU. But look,
so Project Fear was a mistake?
Well, I mean, that's your characterisation. I would say we ended up talking about the economy because other things that we might have wanted to talk about, like the fact that it's good for Britain to get on with its European neighbours, that it's good to be part of a multilateral rules-based system, that it's good for Britain to try and shape world events. All of those arguments, and I'm not saying we can't try and do those things out of the EU, although I think it would be more difficult, all of those arguments really were falling on deaf ears, and so the economic arguments came to the fore in the campaign. But look, I'm the first to say it didn't work, which is why I'm here, and I'm not the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Did you think all the way through it might not work? Because it was reported in a book that when David Cameron came to you and said, I've got this great idea for a European referendum, you said, well, that'll mean two things. One, we'll lose it, and two, we'll destroy the Tory party. Did you say that?
Well, look, I wasn't a great fan of having a referendum, but I'm also a team player. And I think politics is at its most successful when you're a team. And you know, one of the things that I can look back on is a very happy time in Downing Street because I worked very closely with people like David and others to try and achieve things and turn around this country. Once we were in the referendum, I did everything I could to win it. And I was not going to try and sit it out. I felt, you know, it was an important enough issue about the future of the country. I felt strongly about it, that I was prepared to do what I knew I was doing at the time, which was damaging my reputation with fellow Conservatives who didn't agree with me, because in the end, you know, what is the point of doing those sorts of jobs if you're not fighting for what you think is right?
But you also damaged your reputation because what you were saying at the time turned out not to be true. We didn't have the huge recession immediately after the vote. We didn't have the punishment budget. We haven't lost all those jobs. In fact, the economy is going quite well. Do you now look forward at the possibility of Brexit being quite good for us economically?
Well, look, I certainly hope that the predictions that I made and others made before the referendum turn out not to be true over the medium term. I sweated blood to turn the British economy around. I'm incredibly proud that we got all these people into work and that we made Britain the fastest growing economy in the West. But let's wait and see what happens. You know, the pound fell sharply, and we're not going to pretend anymore that that doesn't mean the pound in your pocket isn't worth any less. Britain is poorer as a result, and all of the forecasts, including the government's own independent forecasts show the economy is going to slow next year. But I'm interested in the future, and what the future tells you at the moment, and what financial markets tell you today, is that every time they think Britain is going to have a less close relationship with our trading partners in Europe, every time there's a hint from the government or the government minister says something like that, then the pound falls, and in effect the world is betting against Britain. And every time you have thoughtful contributions from members of the government saying, well, actually we need some kind of transition, we do need to have something more than the World Trade Organization rules. Every time you hear something like that, the world bets on Britain. So, we're well placed to make a great success of this century. We've got a very competitive economy. We've got really successful entrepreneurial businesses. We've got great workforce. Let's make sure we have close trading relationships with our key neighbours outside the EU. We're leaving the EU, but that doesn't mean we are leaving the trading arrangements that have sustained this country for centuries.
Because you mentioned the fact that it was a close result, and the 48%. The question really is, what is the role of the 48% in what happens now? Do they still have a voice in the way that we leave the EU? Do you have views about how we should get out, which, as it were, might tend more towards the soft side of the spectrum?
Well, I don't think we can go on thinking about the 48 and the 52, even though I was in the 48%. We're 100%. We're part of 100% of the people who live in this country. The referendum has happened, we're leaving the EU. Of course, the question on the ballot paper was, do you want to leave the EU? It was not about the new arrangement we have with the rest of Europe. And I am certainly someone who believes that it is in Britain's national interest, our economic interest, our security interest, that we have the closest possible relations with key partners of ours, like the French and the Germans and the Dutch, who, whether we like it or not, are going to remain our geographical neighbours for time immemorial. We can't tow ourselves out into the middle of the Atlantic. So we have to make this relationship work.
Does that mean that you think we should stay, for instance, the European Economic Area and or the customs union?
Well, I think when we come to these key questions, the customs union, the single market, the EEA, there are a variety of arrangements we can have, and other countries from Switzerland to Norway to Turkey have different relationships with the EU. We should do this on the basis of a hard-headed assessment of what is in our national and economic interest. So, yes, it's true that the grass may be greener outside of those arrangements, and we may be able to conduct new free trade deals with Australia and the United States and so on. But that shouldn't come at a price of giving up the existing free trade arrangements we have with Germany and France.
And you think we can keep those?
Well, that's where I would be starting from. I mean, you can't say we're a beacon of free trade in the world and then the main thing you achieve is a huge act of protectionism, the biggest in British history. We have to understand that whilst I'm a massive fan of trade deals with Australia, I want to do trade deals with China, quite controversial in this country, and will prove to be so, many of these trade deals, when they come to Parliament. But there's no point saying you want all of that trade, but you don't want to do the trade we already do with countries like Germany and France, which of course are absolutely central trading partners to ours.
And do you think the House of Commons should be able to look at the detail of whatever deal we do as we leave the EU in time? In other words, not at the last minute, but before that is finally agreed?
I have to say, personally, I think it's all a bit of an odd debate at the moment. I mean, we live in a parliamentary democracy. Theresa May is the Prime Minister because Conservative MPs, myself included in her case, chose her to be the Prime Minister. And of course, Parliament is going to have to be central to these discussions because our government comes out of Parliament. Now, that doesn't mean that the executive shouldn't show a lead that we don't expect and would like our government to show that lead, and I think they can. But in the end, all of these things are going to be debated in Parliament, whether government likes it or not, because in our system, Parliament can itself insist on debating things next week, next month, next year. We are going to get proper Brexit debates in the House of Commons in 2017. Well, I think we are. In fact, the Brexit debates have started in the House of Commons, and they're already proving that the members of Parliament do want to have a say in these things, and the government is going to have to listen to Parliament.
And to do that, do you think we need to see a proper plan from the government before Article 50 is triggered?
Well, the government have now promised that plan, partly because of parliamentary pressure. And what you need is that realistic assessment. So let's take the example of the customs union.
Yeah.
Okay. If we leave the customs union, we can do our own trade deals. That's the argument. So let's have an assessment of what those trade deals might be, how much do they bring, how realistic is it that we can pass them through Parliament, for example, in return for what we lose from leaving the customs union. I want to see those assessments. I'm very open-minded.
A pretty detailed
I'm
plan.
very open-minded myself about what these best arrangements are for Britain. I'm a passionate believer in free trade, free markets, and access to a global trading system. But let's stop having assertion, and let's, as we move into 2017, start getting into a real debate about the numbers and the arrangements that best suit Britain. Because ultimately, this is not about Parliament. This is about people's jobs, the factories, the services that people provide in this country successfully.
Just on the services, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, you saw the tax revenue that came in from the city and the service sector. How worried are you about the future of the city post the EU's relationship?
Well, first thing, it's not just the city. You know, in Britain's 10 largest cities, financial services is the biggest employer. And 2/3 of all the jobs in financial services are outside London. It's massively important to our country. And you already have, for example, Lloyd's of London, for the first time in its 300-year history, saying it's going to have a European operation. You had my successor, excellent Chancellor in Philip Hammond, being told in Japan that Japanese banks are concerned. So the decisions we take about our financial services arrangements will have a material effect on the prosperity of this country. And I think we can do a deal where we are the financial services centre of Europe, because in my view, the jobs will not simply go to Dublin or Frankfurt. They're much more likely, in my view, to go to New York if we get this wrong.
If we have to compromise, for instance, on free movement of people to get that deal, is that worth doing?
Well, I would not go into this negotiation necessarily drawing red lines. You know, I would say let's go in, we are leaving the EU. That's the only red line I'd draw. Let's go in there and try and get the best deal for Britain, address people's concerns about immigration, which I think are around the fact that people come here and don't work, or they don't assimilate into our society. Sajid Javid's got a great initiative today in that respect. That people see the borders aren't secure and there are migrants jumping out of lorries at Calais and at Dover and so on. There are concerns about immigration which can be addressed, but let us not throw out the baby with the bathwater, and let's not lose the massive contribution that immigrants have made over many centuries and continue to make to Britain's prosperity and society.
You've talked quite candidly about making mistakes in office and how it's difficult to row back from something you've said. Surely the tens of thousands promise on migration was the biggest single one of those.
Well, I think in the end, setting a target that we were unable to hit obviously damaged us in a referendum, because it meant we didn't really have an answer on programmes like this to, you've set this target and how you're going to achieve it, because you've tried all the other levers that you've pulled. I think that
and it's still
the problem
there,
with
this target.
The problem with any target is, you know, within it are all sorts of different types of migrants. There are people who are coming permanently for reasons to, for example, be with their family, but they may not make a big economic contribution to the country. And they're coming to be with us for the rest of their lives. There are also students who turn up. They're only there for 2 or 3 years. And education is one of our biggest export industries.
Keep them coming in.
Well, look, I think it's one of Britain's biggest success stories in the world, and it creates links around the world of affection to Britain.
Should they be counted in the figures, do you think?
Well, when I was the Chancellor, I thought it was not sensible to include them in the figures. But, you know, that's got to be a collective decision.
2 other very quick ones. Once we get this deal, whatever kind of deal we eventually get, passporting and all the rest of it, or not, do you think that should be put to the country in a second referendum?
Well, I don't think we should. First referendum.
No is the answer.
I mean, the first referendum was enough for me. Thank you.
One other question, just about you yourself. I guess your lowest moment probably was being booed at the Paralympic Games. Did that really hurt?
Well, it hurt partly because my children were actually in the audience at the time, but it also made me think again, as Chancellor, that you can't just hunker down in your bunker. You have to go out there and understand the country you're trying to govern. And that's what I'm trying to do now, whether it's with the Northern Powerhouse work that I'm doing, whether it's travelling to these cities to understand why people feel the system's not working for them. Trying to understand how actually the politics in our country is shifting. And so, you know, of course, when you're Chancellor Exchequer, you take difficult decisions and you have to live with them and people will judge you by them. But sometimes those moments do help change you for the better.
And you want to, as it were, relaunch yourself, and you're very welcome here, but you're on the wrong show, and I wonder whether the makers of Strictly have been in touch yet.
Well, this is one thing where Ed Balls is definitely better than me. So I watched it last night, actually, with my daughter.
Have you been asked to go on?
I'm sure I have, but I have turned it down if I was. But
right.
I thought it was, by the way, it's a brilliant piece of television and a great success story.
But
and
it
well
won't
done,
be featuring
Ori.
George Osborne.
It will not be featuring George Osborne.
For now, thank you very much indeed. So there we go, looking back at 2016. Let's turn around now and look forward. If you're confused about the shape of things to come after we leave the EU, my next guest is here to help clear things up. I'm joined by the International Trade Secretary, Liam Fox. Welcome, Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Andrew.
A year ago, I had you on the show and you announced that you were going to campaign to leave the EU. And you were very clear about what that meant. You said no more paying money into the EU, control over immigration, and no further kind of involvement in the customs union. Is that still your view?
What I said was we have to take back our ability to make our own laws, which meant
Yes.
not governed by the ECJ. You're quite right. We had to get control over migration and determine what was good for Britain, set our own policy, not have it set elsewhere, and to make sure we had control of our money. And I think those three messages resonated, although having watched that interview, it was like watching a different era of politics altogether.
Absolutely. George Osborne has just said there should be no red lines in this negotiation. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think that clearly, as George said, that there's a red line, which is we have to leave the European Union.
But apart from that...
But I think the public have also made it very clear that they don't want to see uncontrolled migration in the UK, and they don't want to see us being governed by the European Court. So I think we have to take those things on board. We are a democracy. We have to listen to what was not a consultation with the voters, but an instruction from the voters.
So if we want control over immigration, we can't be inside the single market as things stand. What about the customs union?
Well, these are issues that the government is looking at, and one of the things about the Theresa May government is it's very methodical in its approach. So what we have decided is that we all come to these arguments, as you well know from the referendum campaign, with different views, but we've decided to start to look at the data. George Osborne said we need to have a fact-based decision. I agree with that. We need to look at all the options, all the
including staying inside the customs union.
Well, we have to look
because the reason I ask that, and I want to put this in a non-confrontational way, but if we stay inside the customs union, we can't do international trade deals of the kind that your department was set up to create, and therefore, in a sense, there's no point in Liam Fox.
Well, would be limitations on what we could do in terms of tariff setting, which would limit what kind of deals you would do. That's quite correct. But we want to look at all the different things. It's not binary. I hear people talking about hard Brexit and soft Brexit, though it's a boiled egg we're talking about. It's a little more complex. So Turkey, for example, is in part of the customs union, but not other parts. What we need to do to before we make final decisions is to look at the costs.
This is very interesting to hear Liam Fox talking about the possibility of hybrid arrangements and being partly inside the customs union, because you have always been the arch free trader in terms of the government ministers as we have them now. You're the one who wants to go out into the world and create free trade deals around the world. But if we're inside the customs union, we can't. And Liam Fox accepts that's a possibility.
Well, the government will come to a collective view on this once we've looked at all the issues. And it's correct that we do so, because we can't go for a quick result. We have to get the right result. And whatever result we do come to, we have to be able to put in front of the British people the reasoning for coming to that result.
And you yourself are open to the possibility of staying inside the customs union, yes or no?
Well, I'll argue my case inside Cabinet rather than on the programme. Right. But one thing I think is...
I'm just interested, because you have always been so outspoken on this issue in the past.
And I remain, as George Osborne said, instinctively a free trader. And that matters at the moment for two reasons. Number one is that in the global economy at the moment, the rate of growth of trade is slowing down. And it's slowing down below global GDP. And that means we have to have a more open global trading environment. And at the moment, the only place where people are talking about imposing impediments to trade and investment that don't exist at the present time is in the European Union, and an economy that's relatively flat, that doesn't make sense.
Back in September, you talked very optimistically about the joys of being out of the EU in the World Trade Organization environment. Do you accept that that would mean tariffs between our farmers and our businesses and the EU as it currently exists? Quite substantial ones.
Well, that would be depending on the choices that we make. And I think it's very important that we have continuity in our trade. I think it makes no sense to impose tariffs across the European continent. To whose advantage would it be if we had tariffs against French agricultural goods? It doesn't help the French farmers, and it doesn't help our consumers.
No, indeed. But very interesting. You said there you were in favour of continuity in our arrangements. And there's been a lot of talk about transitional arrangements, so we avoid the so-called cliff edge or the sharp cliff between being in the EU and outside the EU. Are you also in favour of transitional arrangements?
Well, that depends what the actual arrangement is that we come to with the European Union and the timescale needed to implement it. And there are so many variables in that. And of course, it is difficult to accept. People are watching every day now saying, this could happen, this might happen, until we get a clear plan. But what is very clear to me is that you have to look at the business that we have nationally and internationally, the impact we'll have on international trade, to try to minimize disruption on that. But at the same time, you can't afford to buy back into so much of the European Union that we're actually diminishing
really
the effect
in the first
that
place.
the British people told us to do.
Strange job in the sense you've got at the moment then, because you're out talking to people around the world about what might happen after we leave the EU, but you can't yet say what situation we're going to be in, what the situation... Do you have any basic sort of assumptions about the state we will be in as we leave the EU, which then inform the conversations you're having with the Australians or the Americans or the Koreans or whoever?
There are a number of different things going on. First of all is we've got to get Britain's exports up. We had a very successful trip with the Prime Minister in India, where we managed to get 1.2 billion orders for British exports there. That's one element of it. We've also got to get more investment into the United Kingdom, direct investment, that's what my department does, but also British investment elsewhere, so that we can help mature other markets, which then become an opportunity for us. Then on the trade policy element, yes, we've got the Brexit discussions, which will obviously have an impact elsewhere. But there are a lot of other issues about how you liberalise global trade. In particular, it's not just tariffs that are the problem. It's non-tariff barriers that we can talk about liberalising and should be talking about liberalising, because it's one of the best ways, and at this time of year, perhaps we should be thinking about it a bit more, it's one of the best ways to take people out of global poverty.
So you can have conversations about non-tariff barriers and so forth, but you can't have proper conversations about future trade deals until we leave the EU, is that right?
We're not allowed to negotiate trade agreements while we're part of the European Union, but of course it's rational for us to have discussions about trade liberalisation in general, and to scope out what future agreements might look like with other countries.
So you can prepare a lot of groundwork. Does that mean that on the day that we leave the EU, you can be ready to sign free trade deals with the Americans or whoever?
Well, the first thing that we want to do is, of course, to maintain the continuity of agreements that we have. There are 35 EU free trade agreements with other countries. We want to see how we can help maintain the stability of those and market access. We had some very, very good discussions with the government of South Korea, for example, in London just a couple of days ago. And let's see how we can work through those issues. But it's very important to stress that we want the European Union to be successful. We want it to be a strong trading and economic and security partner for the United Kingdom. And therefore, if we can come to an agreement that minimises any trade barriers, it's good for the people of Europe. And it's one thing worth pointing out here, because there'll be a lot of talk this year, 2016, about people's incomes and how far they go. When you get restrictions on trade, it hurts the poor the most, because people on low income spend more of their income on goods, and that's what we've got to ensure, that they're not the victims of politics.
When you launched the Vote Leave campaign, and you were involved at the beginning, you were very clear that we should not be paying in money into the EU after we leave. Is that still your position?
Well, we should determine which projects in Europe. There might be things outside the European Union that we want to...
The $5 billion a year that Mr Barnier is talking about, for instance.
Well, I don't recognise those figures, and, you know, there are a lot of positions being staked out before we get into the negotiations themselves. And I would expect that to continue through the Dutch and the French and the German elections. As you correctly say, my job is to help us prepare for what happens once we've left the European Union itself.
Do you think that once Article 50 is triggered, it's revocable?
I think that once we get there, it's not a matter of legality. It's a matter of democracy. The public have voted for us to leave the European Union. And, you know, as we get into 2017, I hope that people will actually accept that the public have given us an instruction. We passed the Referendum Act. We said we were going to ask the public to tell us what to do about the European Union. And when people try to undermine that result, I ask myself, what don't they understand about the words democracy, referendum or binary?
Well, perhaps what they might say is what people didn't vote on is the deal that we will eventually get. And that's hugely important to people's jobs and livelihoods and so forth. And therefore, it's important that, for instance, the House of Commons has a proper chance to debate on the detail of any deal that you do.
Well, the House of Commons will have endless opportunities, I imagine, to debate on these issues, where I've got a debate coming up in the House of Commons on trade quite soon. And of course there'll be ongoing scrutiny. But our system of government is this.
Including votes.
Well, the public voted to leave the European Union. Yes. Constitutionally, it's the job of the government then to carry out the public's instruction and to provide that plan. It is, of course, Parliament's job to scrutinise what that is.
And to vote on that. So, for instance, the public didn't vote on whether or not we should be in the customs union or indeed the EEA and all those other issues.
Well, you couldn't
that will come to the House of Commons.
Well, you couldn't possibly have had a referendum on all those things. But the public are very clear. We are to leave the European Union as it is now. And there can be no going back on that.
You are, of all the leading Tories that I know, the most, as it were, close to the Americans, particularly to the Republican Party. We've now got Nigel Farage offering himself as a bridge. And he says today that people like you are told not even to speak to him. That seems pretty petty, doesn't it?
Well, I've not had any such instruction. We've had
long-standing
understandings of how we deal with incoming administrations in this country. We've got a full diplomatic team that was close to both the Hillary Clinton and the Donald Trump teams, preparing for the relationship we would have to have. They're working on that at the moment. People also need to remember that the administration is not the only part of American government. We also have Congress, where we've got very strong links. And so we need to work on all of those. We don't need anything as an adjunct to what the government already does and has successfully done in the past.
But if Nigel Farage has this good relationship, and he clearly does, he's had yet another meeting with Donald Trump recently, and he's offering himself as a go-between, isn't it quite small-minded to turn him down?
I think we've got a perfectly good ambassador in Washington at the present time. Last time I looked, there was no other vacancy.
And do you have any personal connections with the Trump administration?
I've never met Donald Trump, but I know obviously that people like General Mattis I knew from my time as Defence Secretary, who's likely to be the Defence Secretary in the US. So there are very strong links, and we'll want to pursue those because we'll want to ensure that in particular our trading and economic relationship with the United States, which is our single biggest economic partner, will be fruitful and open in the future.
If in the House of Commons in 2017 you take these details to MPs and you lose votes, you lose important votes, should you go back to the country for a Brexit general election next year?
No, I think that the last thing that we require is political uncertainty. We're going to have elections in the Netherlands and France and Germany. I think that's quite enough instability for Europe for 2017.
All right, Liam Fox, for now, thank you very much indeed.